The night I kissed a stranger at my own engagement party, I thought my life was over. I was wrong. It was just beginning, but not in any way I could have predicted. His name was Ronan Ashby, and the man I kissed wasn't him. Let me back up. I'd been with Fletcher Ashby for 2 years before he proposed. Fletcher was the kind of man your mother prays you end up with. Steady, generous, the sort who remembered your coffee order and your dentist appointments in the same breath. He worked in urban planning for the city of Boston, believed deeply in things like zoning regulations and community impact assessments, and had once spent an entire Saturday helping my neighbor, Mrs. Paulson, install weather stripping on her door because he overheard her say she was cold at night. That was Fletcher. That was the man I said yes to. The engagement party was his parents' idea. The Ashby family had this sprawling Victorian in Brookline, the kind of house that had a name, actually had a name, the Elm House, stitched into a little plaque by the front gate. And his mother, Catherine, had been planning the party since approximately 5 minutes after Fletcher showed her the ring. 60 guests, catered, string lights in the backyard. I wore a cream-colored dress that I'd spent 3 weekends looking for, and had finally found at a boutique on Newbury Street that I definitely couldn't afford. I was nervous. That's the honest answer to why any of it happened. I was nervous in the way you get nervous when you're stepping into a life that's slightly larger than you imagined for yourself, and the Ashby family was. A lot. Not cruel, not unkind. Just a lot. Catherine had this way of looking at you, like she was calculating something, like she was running a quiet, invisible assessment and hadn't decided yet whether you'd passed. Fletcher's older brother arrived late. I didn't even know he existed until 3 weeks before the party. That sounds strange, I know. But Fletcher didn't talk about Ronan. When I'd asked, once early on, whether he had any siblings, he'd said, a half-brother, older, we're not really close, and moved on so smoothly that I'd filed it away and never pulled it back out. I assumed estrangement. I assumed distance. I didn't assume that Ronan Ashby ran a private equity firm out of a 42nd floor office in Manhattan, that he had his face in the financial press twice a year, or that he was the reason the Ashby family had the kind of money that bought Brookline Victorians with names. I found out about him the same way I found out about most things I wasn't supposed to know, by being quiet in a room where people assumed I wasn't paying attention. Catherine was on the phone in the kitchen the week before the party. I'd come over to help address envelopes, her idea, not mine, and she'd stepped away to take a call. The kitchen had good acoustics. Just tell him he's expected, she said. Pause. I don't care what he has going on, Margaret. Tell him Fletcher is engaged and the family will be there. That includes him. Another pause, longer. He can be civil for 4 hours. That's all I'm asking. I didn't ask Fletcher about it that night. I told myself it wasn't my business, that families had their frictions, and that it would sort itself out. I was good at telling myself things like that back then. The night of the party, I was halfway through my second glass of Prosecco, and deep in conversation with Fletcher's aunt about her recent trip to Portugal when I felt it. That particular shift in the atmosphere of a room when someone walks in who changes it. I didn't understand what I was feeling at the time. I just noticed that the conversations around me went half a beat quieter, and then resumed, like a record skipping. Fletcher had stepped away to get drinks. I turned toward the French doors that opened to the back terrace, where most of the guests had gathered. A man was standing just inside the doorway. He was tall in the way that registers before anything else. Dark suit, no tie, collar open at the throat. He had the same jaw as Fletcher, the same dark hair, but where Fletcher's face was open. Genuinely, warmly open, the kind of face that made strangers trust him immediately. This man's face was composed into something more careful, like he'd learned to make it unreadable and had been practicing for years. He was scanning the room slowly, and when his eyes landed on me, they stopped. I thought he was Fletcher. That's the only explanation I have. The dim terrace light, the Prosecco, the fact that I'd spent the last 10 minutes half turned away and had lost track of where Fletcher was. I thought he was Fletcher. Same height, same coloring, same jaw. I crossed the room. I put my hand on his arm and said, "There you are," and kissed him. It was brief. A second, maybe 2. The kind of greeting kiss you give the person you're engaged to when you've been separated at your own party and you're relieved to have found them. But then I pulled back and looked at him properly, and I knew. The eyes were different, darker, and watching me with an expression I couldn't name, not shock, exactly. Something more controlled than shock. Like he was filing the moment away. "Wrong Ashby," he said quietly. His voice was lower than Fletcher's. The floor dropped out from under me. I stepped back so fast I nearly hit the woman behind me. I said something. I don't even know what, some fragment of an apology. And then Fletcher was there, suddenly, with 2 glasses of Prosecco and a smile that went confused the instant he saw his brother. "Ronan." Fletcher's voice had gone flat. "You made it. I did." Ronan's eyes moved from me to Fletcher. He was completely, infuriatingly calm. "Congratulations. He paused. "She seems lovely." I wanted to disappear into the patio furniture. Fletcher didn't say anything else to Ronan that night. Not that I saw. He put his arm around me and guided me back into the party, and when I whispered, "I'm so sorry, I thought he was you," he said, "I know, don't worry about it," in a voice that said he was worrying about it. And Ronan Ashby stood at the edge of the party for the rest of the evening and watched. Not me, not specifically, but everything. With that same composed, unreadable expression, and left before the cake was cut. I told myself it was over. One embarrassing moment, done. But the thing about moments that feel like they should be over is that sometimes they're not. Ronan stayed in Boston for 2 weeks, which I learned the following Friday when Catherine called to invite us to dinner. "Just family," she said, which I'd learned by then meant something slightly more formal than it sounded. The dinner was at the Elm House, 8 people around a dark wood table in the dining room. Catherine, Fletcher's stepfather Jeffrey, quiet, academic-looking. Someone who moved through the Ashby household like he'd long since made peace with not being its center of gravity. Fletcher's younger sister Annabelle and her husband, an aunt and uncle whose names I kept mixing up, and Ronan. He arrived last. He'd changed into a charcoal sweater, no jacket, and he shook hands with Jeffrey and kissed Catherine's cheek and said something low to her that made her laugh. A real laugh, surprised out of her. And I realized in that moment that whatever the distance was between Ronan and this family, it wasn't simple. It wasn't just estrangement. There was something else threaded through it. He sat across from me. He didn't reference the party. He didn't make it weird. He talked about a development project he was tracking in the South End, asked Jeffrey about his research, asked Annabelle about her oldest kid's soccer season. He was fluent in this family in a way that suggested he'd once been more present in it, and had stepped back deliberately, not been pushed out. About halfway through the meal, when the conversation had fractured into smaller threads, he said to me, quietly, not quietly enough to be private, but quietly enough that it didn't carry to Catherine at the end of the table, "You're a physical therapist?" "Yes," I said. "Outpatient orthopedics, mostly. Sports injuries. Fletcher mentioned you'd been at it since undergrad. Since I knew what I wanted to do," I said, which was early. "What made you decide?" It was a real question. I could tell the difference by then, between someone asking something because they felt like they should, and someone asking because they were actually curious. Ronan was looking at me steadily, not in a pressuring way, just in the way of someone who intended to listen to the answer. I told him about my grandmother, about how she'd had a knee replacement when I was 12, and the recovery had gone badly, and I'd watched her work with a PT twice a week in her living room for months, watched her go from barely being able to stand to dancing at my cousin's wedding, and how that had lodged in me like a seed. He nodded slowly when I finished. "That's a good reason. Most people just say that's sweet," I said. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Most people aren't listening. Fletcher from across the table caught my eye just then. His expression was careful in a way I hadn't seen before. Not accusatory, just careful. I looked away first. Ronan didn't leave at the end of those 2 weeks. He extended his stay, citing a deal he was structuring with a fund based in Cambridge. He took a suite at the Mandarin Oriental, and he started showing up. At Sunday dinners, at a gallery, opening Catherine had organized, at the birthday lunch for Jeffrey that happened to fall on a Tuesday, and that Fletcher almost canceled because of a city council meeting he was covering. But he did show up. And when the 3 of us ended up in the same room, which happened with enough frequency that I stopped being surprised by it, I noticed things I couldn't unnotice. I noticed that when Ronan disagreed with someone, he said so, directly, without the softening that Fletcher had built into his communication style, like load-bearing walls. I noticed that he had a specific kind of attention, the kind that made you feel like the most important variable in any equation he was currently running. I noticed that he smelled like cedar and something I couldn't identify, and that I knew this because I'd been close enough to notice. I noticed all of this, and I was engaged to Fletcher, and I knew exactly what I was doing, and I kept doing it anyway. That's not a confession I make lightly. I'm aware of what it says about me. The moment I can point to, the one that mattered, happened on a Thursday evening in late October. I'd had a brutal day. A patient who wasn't recovering the way we'd hoped, a difficult conversation with his family about adjusting expectations. And then my car wouldn't start in the parking garage, and I'd had to call for a jump and sit in the cold for 40 minutes. I'd texted Fletcher on the way home, and he'd responded with a string of sympathetic emojis and said he had a planning board meeting until 9. I was sitting on my couch with takeout I hadn't opened when my phone buzzed. Fletcher mentioned you had a rough day. I'm grabbing dinner at Sycamore. Come if you want. No obligation. Ron and I stared at the text for longer than I should have. I went. Sycamore was on Washington Street, an actual neighborhood restaurant, not the kind of place I'd have associated with someone who stayed at the Mandarin. We sat at the bar because the tables were full, and we ate fried chicken sandwiches, and he asked about my patient, not in a vague how are you holding up way, but with actual questions. And I found myself explaining the specifics of the case, the injury, the complications, the gap between what we could realistically accomplish and what the family was hoping for, and he listened the whole way through without once trying to fix it. I'm sorry, he said, when I'd talked myself down to something quieter. That kind of gap, between what you can do and what they need, that's brutal. It doesn't get easier, I said. I thought it would, eventually. Maybe it's not supposed to, he said. I looked at him. If it got easy, he said, you'd be less good at it. We sat there for another hour after the food was gone, talking about things that had nothing to do with Fletcher, or the Ashby family, or the engagement, his undergraduate years at Georgetown, the summer he'd spent in Jakarta on a logistics project that had gone sideways in instructive ways, the fact that he couldn't cook anything more complicated than scrambled eggs, and had made peace with this. He was funny in a dry, understated way that snuck up on you. I laughed 3 times more than I expected to. Walking back to my car, he said Juniper, which was my name, and the first time he'd used it, and it landed differently than names usually do when people say them. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. Why did you text me? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. We'd stopped by my car. The streetlights on Washington were the old sodium kind, amber, and a little warm. Because Fletcher was in a meeting, he said, and I thought you probably shouldn't be alone with bad takeout and your phone. It wasn't the full answer. We both knew it wasn't the full answer. But it was the answer he gave, and I didn't push, and I drove home and sat in my apartment for a long time thinking about what I was doing. The thing about being in love with someone reliable is that you stop examining it. Fletcher was a constant, and constants don't get scrutinized the way variables do. I had loved Fletcher in the easy, certain way you love something that fits. Not passionately, but securely, and I had told myself that security was what I wanted. I think what I'd actually wanted was not to be afraid. Ronan frightened me in a way that had nothing to do with who he was, and everything to do with what I felt, which was too much, too fast, too tangled up with things I couldn't justify or explain. I told myself to stop seeing him outside of family occasions. I managed this for 11 days. On the 12th day, he called. Not texted, called. I need a second opinion, he said when I picked up. On what? I'm looking at 2 apartments. I can't decide. I laughed before I could stop myself. You're calling your brother's fiancé to help you apartment hunt. You have good spatial reasoning, he said. I've watched you rearrange Catherine's living room furniture in your head during dinner. You do it when you're bored. I had been doing that. We looked at both apartments that Saturday. One was a converted loft in the seaport with ceilings you could play basketball under and views that were genuinely unreasonable. The other was a smaller place in Back Bay. 2nd floor of a brownstone, wood-paneled library, a kitchen that had been redone with white marble and unlacquered brass fixtures, the kind of kitchen that made you want to cook in it even if you'd made peace with not cooking. The loft is more impressive, I said, sitting in the library of the brownstone. But, he said, but this one feels like somewhere a person actually lives. He looked around the room slowly, then at me. Yeah, he said, that's what I thought too. He took the brownstone. He was in it by the first week of November. Fletcher knew. Not in the way I feared. He didn't find texts or catch us somewhere we shouldn't have been. Nothing had happened that could be pointed to in the way you point to evidence. But Fletcher was perceptive in the quiet way of people who've spent their lives reading public sentiment and community politics. And one evening in mid-November, he sat down across from me at our kitchen table and set his hands flat and said, I need you to tell me what's going on. I sat there for a long moment. I don't know how to say this, I started. Try, he said, quietly. I think I have feelings for Ronan, I said. I don't. My voice broke slightly. I didn't plan this. I'm not telling you because something happened. Nothing happened. But I can't stand here and look at you and not be honest. Fletcher was quiet for a long time. How long? He asked. I don't know. Weeks. He nodded slowly. He looked at the table. His jaw was working. He knows? Fletcher asked. No. He looked up at me. Are you sure about that? I thought about the dinner at Sycamore. The way he'd said my name on the sidewalk. The way he'd looked at me in the brownstone library. He hasn't said anything, I said. Fletcher made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite not one. He took his hands off the table and pressed them together in his lap. I need some time, he said. Okay, I said, you should go. I went. I didn't contact Ronan. I told myself that was the right thing. That whatever I was feeling, I'd torched something, had watched it catch fire from a safe distance, and the least I could do was not make it worse. Fletcher called me 4 days later. I'm not going to pretend, he said, that this is something I can fix by being patient. That's not the kind of problem this is. Fletcher, let me finish, he exhaled. I love you. And I think you loved me really for a long time. But I think maybe what you wanted and what we actually had are two different things. And I've known that for longer than I've let myself admit. My eyes were burning. I'm not the most exciting person in a room, he said, and there was something in his voice that was careful and honest at once, the same precision he brought to everything. I know that. I don't take up a lot of air. And I think you need someone who takes up air. That's not fair to you, I said. No, he agreed. It's not, but it's the truth. We stayed on the phone for another hour, not arguing, not trying to fix anything, just talking the way we'd always been able to talk, which was its own kind of grief because it showed me exactly what I was leaving. The engagement ended that night. I called my best friend, Mara, who came over with wine, and the specific kind of silence. That means I'm not going to say I told you so, because I never actually told you so, but I had concerns. She sat with me until 2 a.m, and when I finally started crying properly, she put her arm around me and didn't say anything useful, which was the most useful thing she could have done. I didn't call Ronan. I didn't call him for 3 weeks. When he called me, a Tuesday evening 2 weeks into December, I almost didn't pick up. I heard, he said when I answered. I figured you would. Silence. Are you okay? He asked. Not really. Getting there. Another pause, longer this time. Juniper. He said my name the same way he always did, like it was something he'd decided on. I owe you an honest conversation. I've been sitting on it for a while and I don't think that's fair to you. My heart was doing something I preferred not to analyze. Okay, I said. Not over the phone, he said. Can I take you to dinner? We went to a small Italian place in the South End. Nothing fancy, red checkered tablecloths, the kind of restaurant that's been in the same family for 30 years and doesn't need to advertise. He'd made the reservation under his name, and the hostess had known it, which told me he'd been there before. We ordered. We made small talk for the first 10 minutes in the careful way of two people who have agreed to say something important and are buying time before they say it. Then he set his fork down and looked at me. From the night of the party, he said, I want you to know that I was aware of what was happening, and I kept showing up anyway. That's on me. I kept showing up too, I said. You were engaged to my brother. You were his brother. He was quiet. I'm not going to make myself the villain of this, I said, but I'm not going to make myself the victim either. I knew what I felt. I should have dealt with it faster. Yes, he said. Just that. Not absolution, not blame, just acknowledgement. What did you want to say? I asked. The honest thing. He looked at me for a long moment. That I haven't felt this way about anyone in a long time, he said, and that I'm aware of the cost of that, and I'm not asking you to disregard the cost. But I'd be lying to you if I pretended it wasn't true. The restaurant was warm and full, and someone at a nearby table was laughing at something, real unself-conscious laughter. "What do you want?" I asked. "To see where this goes," he said. "If you do." I thought about Fletcher, about his hands flat on the table, his voice careful and honest and kind, the kindest it had ever been, delivering the ending we both knew was coming. I thought about what it meant to choose something terrifying over something safe, whether that was wisdom or just a different kind of self-protection dressed up in braver clothes. "I do," I said. "I think I do." He nodded. He picked his fork back up. "Then we take it slow," he said. "And we do it right. We did take it slow. Slower than I wanted sometimes." Ronan was deliberate in everything, in the way he moved through decisions, in the way he talked, in the way he rebuilt things that mattered to him carefully rather than fast. He called Fletcher in January. I don't know everything that was said. He didn't replay it for me in detail, and I didn't ask. What he told me was that Fletcher had said his piece and they'd talked for an hour, and it wasn't fixed but it wasn't ended, that there might be a way back to something given time. I wrote Fletcher a letter. Not an email, a letter, on paper, mailed to his apartment. I said what I should have said better, and I didn't ask him to respond, and he didn't. But a few months later, Mara mentioned she'd run into him at a coffee shop near his office, and that he'd seemed well, that he'd seemed, specifically, lighter than she'd seen him in a while. I held that information carefully, like something fragile. Ronan and I moved in together the following spring, into the brownstone in Back Bay. I hung my grandmother's photo in the library. He stocked the kitchen with things he claimed not to know how to use, but turned out to have quiet opinions about. On Saturday mornings we walked to the farmer's market on Copley Square, and he carried the bags and I picked the produce, and we argued pleasantly about whether white peaches were worth the premium, a debate that has never once been resolved. I think about the night of the engagement party sometimes, the terrace light, the hum of 60 people behind me, the moment I touched the wrong man's arm, and the world quietly rearranged itself. I used to wish it had gone differently, that I'd turned around in time, seen Ronan across the room instead of walking into him, done everything in a cleaner order. I don't wish that anymore. Not because the way it happened was good. It wasn't. Not for Fletcher. Not for the months of damage sorting that followed. But because I think I needed the shock of that moment to stop filing things away, and actually look at what was right in front of me. Ronan still calls me Juniper, like it's a decision he made. He said once, when I asked him about it, that it was just my name. I told him nobody else says it like that. He said, "Good." I didn't have a response to that, which doesn't happen often. We celebrated our first year last spring with a quiet dinner, just the two of us, at that same Italian place in the South End. The hostess remembered him. She brought us a dessert we hadn't ordered, set it down without comment, and walked away. He looked across the table at me. "Still okay with all of this?" he asked. It was a callback. I'd asked him something almost identical at that first dinner with his family, nervously, walking to my car. I hadn't realized until just then that he'd been holding on to it. "Yeah," I said. "More than okay, and that, I think, is the truest thing I can tell you."